My name is the Reverend Christian Briones. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Associate Minister at Mayflower Church here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am this evening's moderator. And I'm really excited to be a part of tonight's event. I would like to start by welcoming you to either close your eyes or lower your gaze or do both. Take a breath. A deep breath, while we take a few moments to acknowledge the land that we are on. Wherever you may be, let us acknowledge that we are all on indigenous land. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and the community members from these nations who reside alongside of us. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. The land we reside on came under the control of the United States through genocide, slavery, treaty violations, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of the land, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, love, and repair through our actions, through our words, and through our relationships. You may now lift your gaze and/or open your eyes. This has been a collaborative effort where different organizations are represented in this virtual space, and we know tonight's conversation will be fruitful. People who were responsible for putting this event together, or the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Vogel from the Center of Sustainable Justice, Dr. Steve Newcomb from Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation, Joan Howe-Pullis from Pax Christi Catholic Community, Liz Loeb, the Associate Director at Minnesota Interfaith Power Light, the Reverend Dr. Justin Sabiatanis, and the Reverend Dr. Gary Green, both professors of social transformation, the Social Transformation Program at United Theological Seminary. And now I will pass this on to the Reverend Dr. Gary Green.
Good evening, all. Thank you again for being with us tonight, and thank you for being willing to bring your whole selves into this community conversation. I just want to say a little bit briefly about how we have decided to frame this event, because an event like this without a frame could go all over the place. But we two words that we want to hold together and thinking about how we want to engage each other is critical and constructive. And these two words held together refer to how we have conceived of this event and the spirit in which we intend for it to proceed. And there's a benefit to holding these together, because critical and constructive allows us to speak honestly about our current political moment while keeping us focused on our reasons for hope and the ways we can live into such hopes through solidarity and thoughtful engagement. This approach is born from our desire to resist two temptations at least two that we've seen at work. One is to devolve into partisan politics, where we simply choose a side and never hear the perspectives beyond what they present of themselves. The tendency to kind of position ourselves with a side in the first place, which often prevents us from listening in truly critical and constructive ways for depth, for our values, for commitments, for those aspects of life where these ideas connect. But then secondly, to allow the pull toward being so politically correct that we upend, or not to allow that to happen, that we upend our own ability and the need to speak critically and constructively about our political moment. Critically, on the one hand, requires an ability to see, and it invites us to see and to look at the pieces that often lie beneath the surface, but tell us so much about how the world fits together. It also entails our ability to and require or responsibility to critique when critique becomes necessary. So this event is framed on one hand around our collective responsibility to speak truth, however we understand that to be, in community and in relation to power when necessary. But on the other hand, to maintain a constructive orientation and keeping our critical engagements pointed toward the kinds of realities that we hope for, the ones that can be constructed, the alternative worlds that we can collectively build. And so thinking constructively also entails that we would keep our engagement focused on what our values are, what our commitments are, and ultimately what we hope to come out of this and this election season and our collective engagement in the world more broadly. And so we invite you to speak critically and constructively, and ultimately in this community, things will be born from our engaging one another.
And now I want to take some time to introduce our panelists for the evening. Tonight with us, we have Tamara Gray, who's the Executive Director and Chief Spirituality Officer of Rabata here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have the Reverend Dr. Gary Green, Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care and Social Transformation here at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. We have Joan Howe-Pullis, the Director of Justice Ministries at Pax Christi Catholic Community. We have Liz Loeb with us, member of Shir Tikvah Synagogue and Associate Director of Minnesota Interfaith Power Light here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we have Yetunde, co-founder of Center of the Heart from Chicago, Illinois.
So I don't know, good evening, everyone here this evening. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here. As I was watching everyone come on one by one and then putting your videos on, I was thinking about the importance of this night and this moment together. I was sat this afternoon to really think deeply about what I wanted to say tonight. What is the question prompt that I was asked? And I just want to make sure you want me to just go for it, right? I think I missed the prompt of what you want me. You want me to start, right? Yes. Okay, good. So today I was thinking about this. What is my vision for the common good? And I kept thinking about this situation that we're all in and how am I defining this moment? Like, how do we, this incredible question of how do we find God in this moment? How does this vision connect to your deepest values and commitments? And this moment that we're in is so filled with grief and fear and anger in so many different ways. There's so much grief of those who've lost loved ones, those who know people who've lost loved ones, those who know people with COVID, those of us who've had COVID maybe and still are not at full capacity after that. There's fear from the disease, fear of breaking down into some kind of a civil war, fear of the loss of democracy, fear on all sort of different levels. And then all of that grief and fear comes together to create anger. And as a spiritual leader, my rhetoric is always around joy and happiness and hope and these kinds of words. And I really reflected today about what in the midst of this fear and grief and anger, when we're coming together, who's coming together and how. And there's a verse in the Quran, in English, it says, "Let there arise amongst you a band of people calling to goodness and enjoining good and removing that which is ugly or evil," depends on how you translate it. "They will be the truly successful." And I was reflecting on that today, and I feel like that is my anchor, the belief, the hope that people will come together. And I was thinking about this afternoon, and then as I saw everyone coming on today, I thought, yeah, this is where I have hope. right here, where individuals are coming together from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of lifestyles, a variety of ages and ethnicities, and every possible human variety, really. But coming together because we care about goodness and we care about the common good, good for all, good for everyone, that which is good and beautiful to come back into our lives. And I think that this creating pockets of goodness I really believe that when we create pockets of goodness, that goodness will overcome the fear and the anger and the grief, which I think those three words fall under that ugly space, the space of evil, the space that causes pain. And if I look back in history, my specialty is not world history, but Islamic history. And I see that these sorts of situations of great fear, whether disease, looking at the Spanish flu, or looking at the Black Plague, or looking at war, or loss of democracy and freedoms, and systemic racism and systemic injustice, I think I'll just say, of all types. This has happened before, but constantly and consistently, we've learned that one person can make a difference. That one person can make a difference in evil. One person can stir up an ugliness that we didn't even know was there. And one person can make a difference in good. One person can stand up and make a real difference. And I think the tradition of prophets teaches us that. The tradition of people of goodness teach us that. Women, I think of Jane Addams, someone not very well known, but she had a great effect on goodness, just plain old goodness in the United States, in social work and such things. And so I think really my reasons for hope are all of you. My reasons for hope are that I do believe that a band of people has arisen, and we are working to call to goodness, and we are working towards good conduct, and we are working towards the really ultimate goal of removing all of that which harms and hurts our neighbors, those who are not our neighbors, our global neighbors. Today, we all sit in the same internet room, and we all live in very different places. I imagine many of us do live in Minnesota here, but I also imagine that many of us live all around the world. And so suddenly we are all neighbors. And so in coming together like this, we can really hopefully, and this is where I find God, the effect of the blessing of belief and of faith, and the ability to be constructive by working together and making those changes. So those are my reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much for offering that, Tamara. Thank you so much for being here in this space with us. And now we will hear from Reverend Dr. Gary Green.
Yeah, I echo that, Tamara. Thank you so much for such a beautiful reflection and a vision of the common good and of the divine at work in our midst, as we join across diverse perspectives and identities and religions, and then there's a power in that. My reflection is more specifically grounded in terms of what I recorded were some of my values and commitments that was on that sheet that some of us used to watch the debate. And it's very important. Community is very important to me. Solidarity. And then there's racial justice and racial equity. As an African-American man who grew up in Texas and who now lives in the Twin Cities, race is something that's always at the forefront of my consciousness. I'm always confronted with it in different ways. And a lot of the conversation that has come out of the debate has been really, in a way, hung up on this idea of Donald Trump not denouncing white supremacy. And a lot of the news coverage has followed this and really been hung up on it. And And even when that converged on that moment where the moderator and where Joe Biden were urging him to denounce it, then denounce it, then denounce it. And I kept thinking about what would happen if he would have said, I denounce white supremacy. What kind of potential complacency about that issue could have ensued from onlookers, from people engaging the debates? And I think it speaks to what I want to share in the way of critical and constructive of how we misunderstand the nature of white supremacy, and how it's important to talk about it in relation to the candidates, but it's more important that we keep a broader conversation going regardless of these candidates, because those things can help keep us focused on what are those pieces that we need to be embodying and engaging to bring about racial justice and racial equity. So I want to mention three things about white supremacy that I think will help make a distinction that can end up being more constructive for us. Because every time the news covers it, and when people talk about the failure to denounce, they're specifically talking about one expression of white supremacy, right? A militant white nationalism that when we single out that group, it can be easy for a lot of us to say, well, I'm not that, so I don't need to worry about this. And the misconception is that white supremacy is actually at least three things simultaneously, only one of which are the specific expressions that was the topic of conversation when Donald Trump would or would not denounce, okay? Specifically talking about one brand of it, or one practice in the lifeblood of this thing called white supremacy, because white supremacy is also a reality. And when I say a reality, I mean a collective, collaborative, and really a coordinated way of being in which we all participate in this country. The extent to which certain structures hold ways of being in place, the extent to which some systems and practices that we engage in a real second nature way, or in an effortless way, even down to the language that we use, i.e. blackmail or blackball, or some of the other language that is rooted in this deeper idea of white supremacy that started long before, but has continued to be brought into fruition in our daily lives. So it's the expressions, yeah, and it's also a reality that we have to engage with to begin to try to see what are the pieces that are creating and recreating this broader reality in relation to which we all live. But thirdly, there is white supremacy as an idea. Beyond the ways in which it's written into the fabric of the United States, and still very operative, even when we use post-racial conversations or post-racist, or when we assume that we live in a post-racist society, it's a part of the status quo, which means if I'm not resisting it, I'm probably reproducing it with all my well-meaning intentions. And it's because white supremacy also is an idea. Specific expressions, a reality in which we all participate, and a specific idea that originated during European colonial imperialism all across the world. Thank you, Christi, for lifting up that land acknowledgement, because that's part of where that lies. This idea that in some way, one race of people is better than another race of people. And while none of us would perhaps admit that or say that explicitly, we still have to take stock of the reality in which we live that assumes that, and that tries to structure the way that we live collectively, that structures our language, that structures our social systems, that structures the structures of themselves, and structures our political climate. So that whether or not Donald Trump denounces this one specific aspect of white supremacy, we should stay focused on the broader conversation of racial justice and racial equity that transcends him, that transcends Biden, but invites all of us into a constructive collaboration in terms of how we not only can dismantle this, but how we can remake a world where that does not exist. So in terms of constructively, I'm encouraged actually by what I've seen after the George Floyd incident. right? Because in a strange way, there was a collective kind of response that has been new in my life that I have not seen. And what that says to me is, as human beings, not only do we exist with the capacity to wake up and to see differently, but I also believe we exist with the inherent goodwill to do so when we see what has happened and what is going on. And so as I just reflect on this moment, I'm encouraged by the fact that raising collective consciousness has already begun. And it's precisely what we're doing in this space, that when people from different walks of life come together and push and pull each other's perspectives, we take each other to a different level of consciousness in relation to the politics of our world. And we give ourselves more of a basis of solidarity from which to say, this is not the world we want to live in. No, this is the world we want to live in. And we work toward that collectively. So I'm encouraged to be here. I'm really glad that this is a conversation that we are having, because it encourages me as an African-American man, but it also encourages all of us to envision the kind of world we can live in and give us something to hope for.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Gary Green. Appreciate your reflections on that. It's going to be a critical piece moving forward, this conversation about race and it being beyond this caricaturization of these fringe far-right wing groups. And now let us hear from Joan Howe-Pullis, the Director of Justice Ministries at Pax Christi Catholic Church here in Eden Prairie, Minnesota.
Thank you. So I was thinking about how to even begin tonight after the debate, because it felt like the debate really didn't give us anything to chew on based on our reflection guide. The reflection guide was just didn't relate at all to what happened at the debate, in my opinion. And so I was a little worried about this conversation tonight and how I would like tie it back to values and my faith tradition and how I see this moment in time. But then of course, I remembered that that's the whole point, that we are meant, all of us, to be engaged in public life. My Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching tradition, tells me that I am meant to take my faith and bring it into the world. And so whether or not the debate actually engaged in the conversation that I think we need to be having in this moment in time, we can have that. And so then I decided that what I'd like to do is highlight 3 things that I'd like to have a conversation about in community with faithful people. And luckily also, as I was trying to figure out how to structure this, just this week, Pope Francis published an encyclical on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi called Fratelli Tutti, which is brothers all. And those were St. Francis's words. And today we would say siblings all, to be inclusive. And there were some real great gems from this document that I'd like to highlight. But first, I'd like to tell you about the 3 conversations that I'm really interested in having right now in this time with people of faith. One, we have to talk about racism. So I'm so glad that Gary unpacked racism and specifically white supremacy. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but I just want to just reiterate that we're discovering in our faith community of Pax Christi this year that this is the conversation we know we need to have in order to understand everything else that our entire culture is situated on. The structures and system of racism is in every other system of injustice. And so we know that we need to be about unpacking white supremacy in all of its forms, and it's up to us to do that. And so I'm really, really happy that we're doing that. It just so happens in this encyclical, Pope Francis also highlights the fact that the church, the Catholic Church, took such a long time to acknowledge and to unequivocally condemn slavery. And so I'm just was reminded of that as Gary was saying, you know, what would have happened if Donald Trump actually did unequivocally condemn white supremacy? Would it have changed anything? Well, Pope Francis says we still are not dealing with racism in the world, and that we have to. Our social teaching tells us that at the center of all of what we understand about our relationship with each other and with God is that human beings are sacred, that each person is sacred. And so if we believe that, then we have to undo these structures of racism. The other thing I'd like to talk about in conversation tonight is about freedom. In America, we have this particular vision of freedom, which means that we are individuals that get to accomplish our lives independent of other people, and that we get to sort of do as we wish. But our faith tells us that we are social, that inside human beings, we're not just individual human beings, sacred beings, yes, but sacred and social. And so our faith is communal, that our existence is communal. And so when we talk about freedom, if we forget the communal aspect or the common good, we've missed the point. And so much destruction and violence is done in the name of individual freedom. So I think that's another thing that we need to talk about. Pope Francis says, liberty becomes nothing more than a condition for living as we will, completely free to choose to whom or to what we belong, or simply to possess or exploit. That this shallow understanding has little to do with the richness of a liberty directed above all to love. And so if we only consider ourselves free in terms of individual freedom, then we have the awful capacity to only choose who we want to belong to instead of recognizing that we all belong to each other. And we also have the awful freedom to exploit people, one another, as opposed to what we're called to, which is ultimately to love our neighbor. And finally, the last conversation that I think is really important to have, and I'm so excited that we're going to be talking this evening, and that is about good politics. So if we are called to public life, and we are, and if we understand that at the center of everything is the sacredness of each human being and everyone on the planet and the planet, then what we have to also know is that we have a responsibility, each and every one of us, to engage in politics, to engage in a kind of politics that brings these values to the public space and unequivocally holds up these values. And so everything then depends on our ability to be self-critical and also to engage with one another with honesty, with integrity, to make amends when we fall short, and to actually push for these conversations, even as in our political realm, we may be experiencing what we saw, I believe, at the debates, which was a very cynical display of power over, as opposed to let's talk about how we can build power together or build a vision for the world. So those are the three things that I'm interested in really examining during this election cycle and into the future. For me, these are the essential questions that people of faith in America need to confront and need to continue to have as conversations with one another. And as those are the critical things, but also on the constructive side of it, I would say I'd just like to share one more quote from this encyclical. I read it like twice in the last 2 days, and it's just beautiful. But Pope Francis gives us this constructive way to begin to enter all of these really essential conversations. And what he says is, it is my desire that it is our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration of fraternity or family life. family feeling, family love, fraternity between all men and women and people. Here we have a splendid secret that shows us how to dream and to turn our life into a wonderful adventure. No one can face life in isolation. We need a community that supports and helps us, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. How important it is to dream together. By ourselves, we risk seeing mirages, things that are not there. Dreams, on the other hand, are built together. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home. Each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her or their own voice, brothers, sisters, siblings, all.
Thank you so much, Joan, for offering your reflection. Up next is Liz Loeb, member of Shir Tikvah and Associate Director at Minnesota Interfaith Power Light.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. My name is Liz Loeb. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here on Dakota land in Northeast Minneapolis. And right now, Jews around the world are celebrating the holiday known as Sukkot. When I try to explain Sukkot to non-Jewish friends, I end up sort of hopping around while talking about the way we make little huts in our gardens that are open to the rain and to the starlight, and about the way we eat food from the earth in those little huts with our friends and with anyone who wants to come and be welcomed. And then once a day, we sort of do an interpretive dance with a little lemon-like fruit called an etrog and a bower of tree branches called a lulav. And Sukkot is one of the many reasons why I love being Jewish. It has an interpretive dance and food in a garden. But Sukkot also serves as a critical function in the Jewish wheel of the year. Sukkot comes right after the intensity and collective soul searching of Yom Kippur, and it invites us to burst forth into the joy and possibility of the land that nourishes us and of the sensual, physical bodies in which we live. Sukkot brings us into the communal celebration of Simchat Torah, and it prepares us with pleasure and connection for whatever may come next. Sukkot reminds me that the land is still here, still breathing and resting and growing and releasing, finding its ways towards seasons again and again, no matter what might be happening in our election cycle. This year, as I davened over Zoom for Yom Kippur with the Shir Tikvah community, I found myself thinking about how many Jews had davened for Yom Kippur in secret. My people have chanted Kol Nidre through the Spanish Inquisition, through war and famine and plagues and more plagues and displacement and dictators and autocrats, and through the Shoah, through the Holocaust. We have gathered in caves and on boats, in tiny dirt basements and in attics, in village study houses with not enough wood to keep warm, in deserts and in temples, and in lands rich with fruit and water, in shtetls and in cities, in bondage and in freedom. And I thought, thank goodness, we do not have to figure this all out on our own. People have faced challenges and complexity before. We are part of the flow of a complicated history of people yearning for one another. And that, to me, is a great comfort. Many of us, or many of the people with whom I'm in community and organizing, are talking about this moment as a fight for democracy. And what I know as a white Jew is that Black and Brown and Native and POC and Indigenous folks have told us and known for centuries that US democracy is a myth covered in the wounds of land theft, genocide, treaty violation, and enslavement. We must name the truth that we have never had free and fair elections in this country. And we must fight for the basic principles of democracy, knowing that we are in service of shared liberation, that we are in service of the possibility of something that has never fully been, knowing that to get there, we will need to repair deep and systemic harm, and that we will need to transform the ordinary structures in our everyday and intimate lives that make white supremacy possible. Also, we do this knowing that none of us are free until all of us are free. So right now, the current presidential regime is intensifying, stoking, and encouraging racist violence against our elections. And a huge part of our job is to resist normalizing that violence as part of our political debate. I refuse to accept that there is somehow two sides to white supremacy, or that violence against people who are trying to cast their vote is somehow a position that can be argued. On the basic issue of somebody's humanity, there is no other hand. And I say this also as a queer person. If you are denying my right or the right of those I love to exist, then you and I are not in a conversation. As best I understand it, the highest religious and ethical commitment of a Jew is to act on the side of life, to protect life. I believe that as people of spiritual practice, or of faith, or of conscience, we have a responsibility to tell the sacred truth about the dignity of all people, and to fight for a world of more life, for a world where no one is in a cage. And friends, right now that means voting. It means driving our friends and colleagues and families absolutely up the wall with friendly pestering until they have committed to plan to vote too. Most people have their minds made up about the person for whom they're voting, but research shows that whether somebody actually goes ahead and casts their vote often depends on whether they know and whether they talk to somebody that they know and trust about voting. Supporting someone to cast their vote and to feel like their vote matters, especially when the current administration wants us to feel like our votes don't count, is a radical and necessary act of democracy, and it will make all the difference. Against great odds and facing great violence, communities have fought and died for the right to vote. And now we are the inheritors of that responsibility and of that hope. So let's vote. Let's reject a politics of racism and authoritarianism. And let's keep working towards the world of shared liberation of which we dream. That's our power. And this is our time to use it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your reflection, Liz. And now we will hear from Yetunde, who is the co-founder of Center of the Heart in Chicago, Illinois.
Hello, everyone. I am feeling impressed. I'm really impressed and touched by what has been shared up to this moment. All the truth that has been spoken, the visions that have been shared, the variety of voices, the diversity of voices makes me want to say, you know, it's good to be with family. It's really good to be with family. And I want us to remember, I want us to come to believe that about each other, that we belong to each other, that we are siblings, like Joan said, that we are siblings. Because if we don't look at each other in this way and come to believe in each other in this way, then they will have won. And I think you know who I'm talking about, and I think you know what game I'm talking about. The pressure that's been put on us over the last 5+ years of turning away from each other, seeing each other as the enemy, being suspicious of one another, being gaslighted every day, throughout the day, several times a day, for 4 to 5 years straight. It's worn on me. I don't know if it's worn on you, but it's worn on me. And to friends who have told me recently, I don't know what to believe. And 4 years ago, they wouldn't have said that. And so I know something has worked about this gaslighting, that people don't know what to believe. So one of the things that I'm interested in is, how do we come to know what is true again? How do we come to embrace what is true? How do we speak the truth? How do we protect the truth? I don't want to dwell in cliches about the truth will set us free, but you know what I mean. We know that lies don't set us free. We know that we're enslaved by this gaslighting. And so what will it mean for us to be free and to embrace truth and be able to tell the truth, even if we fear telling it? Some time ago, I was with a group of, I forgot to say, I'm supposed to represent a Buddhist point of view. I don't look Buddhist, but I'm supposed to represent a Buddhist point of view. I was with a group of Buddhist chaplaincy students not long ago. And I can't remember exactly what we were talking about, but I asked them, how many of you are afraid of Barack Obama? And they paused and they looked at me and they began to giggle. And of course, no one raised their hand. And then I said, how many of you are afraid of Donald Trump? And all 40 hands went up. I think that is a truth that is shared by many people that we're not admitting to openly. We are afraid of our president. We're afraid. And what if we were to say that? How might that free up other people to say, yeah, you know what, I'm afraid too. And I don't like living in fear. So what are we going to do about it? That's really what I'm most concerned about. What are we going to do about the situation we are in? And when I was asked to watch the debate or to participate in the panel, I had already decided that I wasn't going to watch the debate, that my body told me already what I need to know. If I were to watch the debate, it would be for performance purposes only. And so after agreeing to be on the panel, I said, well, I guess I'd better watch the debate so I would have something to say. And I think it was within 20 minutes, probably within 5 minutes, I began to lower the volume. And then I lowered the volume again, and then all the way to where I couldn't hear anything. And then about 20 or 30 minutes, after being distracted by other things, I just said, I cannot take this into my body, into my consciousness right now. And I remember feeling a sense of loneliness from that 20 minutes of watching that exchange. I felt loneliness and I felt alienation. And I began to wonder, being a Buddhist practitioner, is this what people who go to the rallies feel after having absorbed all of this hatred? Is this what they feel? I see them cheering, I know they're cheering, but how do they really feel? And then I began to feel compassion. I began to feel like this is hard to hold. The feeling that I'm alone, I'm lonely, that other people are the problem. But there's this concept, and I don't know, Gary, if I'm going to break the rules of our engagement here, but there's this concept in Shambhala Buddhism called idiot compassion. In other words, compassion needs to be combined with wisdom in order for it to be most beneficial. And so sometimes I know that we rush to compassion or we rush to forgiveness. But the bottom line is that as of today, 210,000 people in the United States have died of COVID. And it said that probably 165,000 of them didn't have to die. So yeah, I feel some compassion, but it's not idiot compassion. This is a time for some lessons on atonement. And so far, I'm not seeing that. My hope, and in closing, is to say this, is that I feel like Christianity has been perverted. There is nothing in the Gospels that supports spreading illness and death. And I would like to see liberal and progressive Christians utilize their positive power to frame and take back the narrative of Jesus' story. And if it means engaging in Christian Buddhist dialogue to get there, that's the part that I want to play. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Io, for your reflection. To Io and to all of the panelists, thank you all so much for your reflections and for your thoughts. And now you will be put into break rooms to converse among yourselves about some topics the panelists have brought up and have discussed tonight. And now for this portion of the event, we have a dialogue in question that's going to happen. And this will be, what you're going to do is you're going to open your chat and you're going to type in your question there. And everyone's questions won't be answered, but we'll pick out some questions and yeah, we'll go from there. We'll just have a little question and dialogue. How do we define the common good? This question is from Jean Bringold, Pro.
I guess I'll take a stab at, oh, Liz, did you?
No, you go, Gary.
And I have Jean in class too, so it's we problematize how to speak definitively about what truth is or common good or things of that nature. So for me, when I hear that question, and as situated in this this particular election season, for me, it's the attempt to define the common good and attempt to understand the common good that I look for specifically in candidates. For example, you know, when I hear the phrase the common good, or when I think about how I envision the common good, I envision us oriented, not self in terms of our self-interest, but like you said, Joan, in your panel presentation, how we don't see ourselves as individuals with this notion of freedom that as situated in a broader capitalist world that tells us that we are individual agents and we can do and say and exist in a way that is largely disconnected from other people, which really all that does is get us to wash our hands of some of the suffering that we participate in, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So for me, in terms of defining the common good, it starts by first recognizing that as human beings, we exist in a relational web and everything that we do affects common life. So if I want to define common good, I acknowledge that my definition is going to be limited and it's going to require the presence of persons that are different than me to hold these definitions in tension to figure out collectively what emerges. So I guess on the face, I would say, I don't know how to define the common good for everyone because I don't exist with that capacity to, but I know some of the pieces that I would like to be present at the table when we have a conversation about what does the common good look like? And it requires my personal commitment to both understanding my unique needs in the cultural context that I live in, but also understanding that I'm a part of a broader human community, and I need to hear from other voices that can stretch my ability to see beyond what I can see based on my unique social location.
So may I jump in and say, you know, Dr. Green, Dr. Gary Green, you know that at least you belong. And your absence from that conversation would be evidence of lack of a common good, just by your absence. So then I will say, by extension, then that we all need to participate in that conversation, even if we at the end we don't agree on what the definition is. The fact that we participated in the conversation gets us closer to an understanding. Thanks.
The other panelists want to jump in on that question? If not, I have another question waiting.
I just have one thing to add to this, and that is that in the conversation for the common good among folks that whose social location has been comfortable and attaining a kind of American cultural success, their vision of common good may look very different than other folks. And we have to be careful about the word common good doesn't mean the way we've always seen the American dream, for example. And so I just wanted to sort of deconstruct a little bit of like what might be a preconceived notion of sort of a utopian way of being the dominant narrative in the United States about how people should live, or what would make them feel good and happy, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about united humanness.
LaShella Sims here. I would go back to the bottom line and use this as an example of all of us in participating in this panel here, and that we all are alive. In order for us to stay alive, we all need food and water. We all know that. And so we work together to see that everybody gets food and water. But where it can break down is we can divide ourselves into various aspects to determine who gets how much food, who gets how much water, and things like that. But the common good is we work together to stay alive with things that we need to continue to stay alive. But it can break down with our way of thinking and acting towards each other.
This idea of the common good and the commonality is not a new one. One of the most famous lines, I think, in poetry is, ask not for whom the bell tolls. Basically, it was written by an English clergyman named John Donne, who the rest of that talks about the fact that we are all part of humanity. And when the bell tolls, it tolls for us. So it emphasizes, and I can't quote the whole poem, but it basically emphasizes our common humanity back when he was writing. So it's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. It's just a question of how we realize it.
Thank you all so much for commenting. Let me move forward to the next question. This is a question that we're all wondering and that we're all trying to live right now. I feel like, how do I critically and constructively converse with friends and family that don't see my concerns and fears as valid and are resistant to logic I have used that I find quite convincing as showing valid concerns? Gary, I know recently you and I had talked about the different games that political parties are playing and how some of the tricks have become obsolete, or some parties are playing a game that other parties are not playing anymore. So that makes me think of you. I hate to single you out like that, but if you want to comment on that, I think you might have some interesting thoughts on that.
Well, I'll comment a little bit on what we talked about and kind of the difference, because maybe that'll help folks. In terms of my response to that specific question, that's a puzzling one, because one, I'm fortunately, I'm not in that situation where I have had practice to have those necessary conversations, but I know that many are. And just to briefly reference what Christian just spoke about, we talked about how on one side you have a party that, at least in some situations, attempts to try to appeal to moral sensibility, to some idea of what's right and what's wrong. And then you have another party where in certain situations, it's not necessarily about what's right and wrong. It's about maintaining power and making the moves necessary to secure that. And my ethics students would tell you there's a difference between, a kind of deontological or duty-based approach to situations and a goals-oriented approach to situations. And basically what we talked about was that they're speaking two different languages with two different sets of rules to a game that they're playing in two different ways. And so I don't know if that helps, thinking about how do I talk to family members, or how do I try to use logic to convince of my arguments. Maybe understanding that gosh, I'm not sure. The rules that I'm speaking with them about are different. The way that I'm approaching this question, the way that I'm approaching how I'm interpreting political events, it exists in a completely different reality that I think points back to how we have been so isolated and rendered individuals that we've gotten so disconnected that we don't even speak the same language. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, outside of helping us to see what we're up against, at least in that sense, in having those conversations.
Any of the other panelists want to speak to that? Let us move. I'm going to move on to our next question. Our next question is from Joan. Pope Francis says we must dream together. Can you give examples of where you see that happening now? Who's dreaming and what dreams are emerging?
So I think that was for me. I don't know who it was from.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. That's right.
So I would say what came to mind when I read that passage and ruminated on what that means is an example for me right now is the vision of the Green New Deal. It's a huge vision for collective action across socioeconomic and racial lines and all around the world. And the people who are needed to participate in creating what should happen are all of us, and nobody's going to get left out. Like the vision for the Green New Deal is that people who have been economically and racially marginalized and have been at the worst effect of climate crisis will be the people who will be able to engage and participate in creating new energy, new economic system, and a healthy planet. So it's going to take everybody, and the vision for that is just phenomenal.
Thank you, Joan. Next question is, we talked in my small group about the way this event brings us together across differences to talk about shared values, values that connect us to something larger than ourselves, call that God or whatever. We concluded that faith communities provide that for us, but there's something special about coming together across different faith traditions. So that gives us, well, me, an opportunity to find common ground around shared values in a way that allows us to connect those values with actions in the secular world, if you will. What ideas do you have about the ways we can leverage this quality from this event and extend it into the world, into the future beyond this?
Here's an idea. It's just an idea. I think, you know, hearkening back to the question about how do I help people understand where I'm coming from, or how do I make them understand? We don't have any control over that. We can't control what people will take away from what we're saying. But this may sound very simple, but empathy, compassion, deep listening, trying to understand goes a very, very long way, as well as acts of solidarity. And I think when it comes to being in solidarity with others, for me, I don't know everything, but I do trust. I trust that people are in need. I trust that they are suffering. I trust that they can't do what it is that they need to do by themselves. I trust if they say they need other voices, then I try to give voice where there is none. If they need a letter, I'll try to write a letter. But these are the ways, and some of them are proven ways of how we can work with each other to bring about sanity, which is what we really need, a big dose of sanity right now. And then combining it with the conversation of the common good. I mean, we may not know it when we see it, but we know it when it's not there. For example, when we were trying to figure out what was going on with COVID, and the news came out that brown and Black people are more susceptible to becoming ill and dying. Within a day, maybe 2 days, maybe not even that long, the president said, well, let's open this country wide open, right? Back to business as usual. Now that is not a common good move, right? That's saying, brown and Black people, you're on your own. White people, let's keep it moving. Astonishing. So I think we have to take the risk to have conversations with people who we know don't get where we're coming from, because there's no other way to move forward but to have those conversations, unless we want to try to make power moves over people, and then who are we becoming if we do that?
Thank you so much for your words, Io, and for your thoughts and reflections. I feel like that was much needed in my heart. So thank you so much for that. And with those words, let us conclude this portion of the event. As we gather here tonight and as we go forward, saying that there is much at stake with this upcoming election would be a painful understatement. In the context of our American presidential administrations, it would simply be a lie to not acknowledge that historically, whether through complacency or empty symbolic words or acts of solidarity, or sometimes outright rhetorical violence that emboldens the most horrific of what America can be, shout outs to white supremacist militias or dismissing climate scientists who are warning us about a climate crisis, both parties have caused damage to our communities throughout the decades. I want to encourage everyone who is here tonight who might be discouraged to take heart and to know that we can build a better America, a better world, In my work, I preach, I teach, I write, I march in the streets. I use every tool at my disposal to create a more just and loving and kind world. And even someone like me who is disillusioned in our political system, if I believe in love and compassion and justice, I still must utilize every tool that I can think of and that I know of. And I still have to recognize voting as one of the many tools that we can use to create a more just and a more loving world. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening, and I will now pass this next section on to the Reverend Dr. Justin Sebia-Tanis.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. We put a slide of information up about if you need more information about voting. There are several resources here. One of the most important things you can do is go to the ballot and go to vote this year in many ways that you can do it. I'm seeing messages from folks asking if we can get together again. Our committee will certainly work together and get back to you with more information about more opportunities to gather. We've been talking about that. And again, on behalf of all the folks who helped organize this, it does my heart so much good to gather in this space to reflect thoughtfully and faithfully about the presence of that which we call holy and the presence of the common good in the midst of this divisive time. And so many, many thanks for being here with us this evening. Thank you, and go in peace tonight.